Good morning, everybody. This is Pastor Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church, Kerrville, Texas. We're back with our confessional study. We're looking at Article 26 of the Augsburg Confession in this episode of the distinction of meats. We're on page 19 of your Blue Book of Concord if you've got one. So let's get right into it here. The first paragraph is going to line up the controversy for us. It has been the general persuasion, not of the people alone, but also of those teaching in the churches, that making a distinction of meats and like traditions of men are works profitable to merit grace and able to make satisfaction for their sins. Underline or highlight the second half of that sentence because that's really the issue at stake here. And that the world so thought this appears from this, that new ceremonies, new orders, new holy days, and new fastings were daily instituted, and the teachers in the church did exact these works as a service necessary to merit grace, and did greatly terrify men's consciences, if they should omit any of these things. From this persuasion concerning traditions, much detriment has resulted in the church. So, Article 26 is called the distinction of meats, but really, they're using the distinction of meats as an on-ramp to talking about the use and abuse of human traditions in the medieval church then. And unfortunately, we're going to see a lot of these are still going on today then. So when we say things like the distinction of meats, we're talking about I only eat fish on Fridays in Lent. Why? Because it either merits grace or it makes me a more spiritual person, something like this. So that would be an example of it. Or not refraining from butter and dairy on certain fast days, etc. Also, then he makes the point here, new ceremonies, new orders, new holy days, new fastings were daily instituted. And what was being taught was that these things were necessary for salvation. And in some places where this wasn't being taught that these were necessary for salvation, the common people latched onto them so, because of the nature of the way that these things were taught. So, distinction of meats, human traditions, it's a question of what exactly do we do with these things? We've been down this road before, but this is a great test case for this. So what do we do with this? First, the doctrine of grace and of the righteousness of faith has been obscured by it, which is the chief part of the gospel, and ought to stand out as the most prominent in the church in order that the merit of Christ may be well known, and faith, which believes that sins are forgiven for Christ's sake, is exalted far above works. So what Melanchthon is saying here is then that there's no problem with human traditions in the church. Go back to Article 15 of the Augsburg Confession and see more about that there. But when works, especially man-made works and ceremonies, are extolled as either meriting grace, earning the forgiveness of sins, earning God's favor, making someone a more spiritual person or a holier person, that all means the same thing. When ceremonies of man, when traditions of man are placed in that position, it dislodges the gospel from its proper position. And so, folks in the medieval ages, much like folks still today in many churches, believe that their outward acts of piety, their outward observance of ceremonies, etc., that's what makes them holy, not the righteousness of faith then. So that's the first problem with this. Skip down to the next paragraph. Second, these traditions have obscured the commandments of God because traditions were placed far above the commandments of God. Christianity was thought to consist wholly in the observance of certain holy days, rites, fasts, and vestures. These observances had won for themselves the exalted title of being the spiritual life and the perfect life. Meanwhile, the commandments of God, according to each one's calling, were without honor, namely that the father brought up his offspring, that the mother bore children, that the prince governed the commonwealth, etc., etc., etc. So the second thing that this does is when you put human ceremonies in as this is the Christian life, that you eat fish on Friday, or that you eat fish on Friday, that you abstain from milk and butter on these days, that you do this, that you wear these kinds of clothing, and that all of these sort of things, that these are the definition of the Christian life, that displaces the good works that God does command. And the good works that God commands are found in the Ten Commandments and lived out according to one's calling. So, is it better to be a monk or to be a father? Well, it's far better to be a father because that one's actually instituted by God, whereas monasticism, going to the monkery or the nunnery, the monastery, or the nunnery, those are man-made works. But yet, in this day and age, in the medieval ages, The monastery was so exalted, the monastic life was so exalted that folks were abandoning families for it, or never having families to begin with. And so the estate of father, mother, child, government, preacher, all of these things were, even worker, citizen, etc., all of these things were being jettisoned for a holier life. And unfortunately, we see that today all over the place too, where you have people who want to locate their righteousness in the things that they do, in their good Christian life, in their transformed Christian life, all of these things, when in reality, it's a matter, like he says, first of all, of the righteousness of faith, not the righteousness of works, and then that faith which justifies brings forth good fruits according to the Ten Commandments, and those things are done in our vocations, in our callings as father, mother, child, grandparent, retiree, citizen, worker, employer, etc., etc., etc. Then he's got one more point to make here. He says on the first full paragraph on page 20, thirdly, traditions brought great danger to consciences, for it was impossible to keep all traditions, yet men judged these observances as necessary acts of worship. So on the flip side of this, the other side of the coin is when you think these things are necessary, and when they keep piling up and inventing more and more and more and more and more things, the conscience eventually despairs, because you can't do them all. And that's part of Melanchthon's point here in this next paragraph then. Now, if we skip down to the second full paragraph here, we're skipping around because this is a rather lengthy one here. The paragraph that starts, wherefore our teachers must not be looked upon as having taken this matter rashly, or from hatred of bishops, as some falsely suspect. There was a great need to warn the churches of these errors which had arisen from misunderstanding the traditions. For the gospel compels us to insist in the churches upon the doctrine of grace and of the righteousness of faith, which, however, cannot be understood if men think that they merit grace by the observances of their own choice. The reason that all this is getting brought up, he says, isn't because of hatred for the bishops, isn't because of a rebellious spirit. It's simply that traditions have been so misunderstood that now folks think these things merit grace. We see this a lot still. I've noticed a lot on Ask the Pastor. I get a lot of comments as well about people just assume that if there's a human tradition in the church, then it's automatically wicked. And that's a misunderstanding of the church, because a misunderstanding of human traditions, because not all human traditions are wicked. In fact, since the gospel, the only worship the gospel demands is faith in the promises of Christ, it doesn't command any external forms of worship. Therefore, all the externals that any church has is a tradition of man. And so you have to judge it accordingly. Is it being taught as necessary for salvation? If it is, then there's a problem. Is it being taught that if you do these things, you're a more spiritual person? Then there's a problem then. So all of this comes from a misunderstanding of human tradition that unfortunately we still have today. It just is in the opposite direction then. Let's go to the next, let's skip a little bit over to the right-hand column. The first full paragraph on page 20. Here our adversaries object that our teachers are opposed to discipline and mortification of the flesh as Jovinian. But the contrary may be learned from the writings of our teachers. For they have always taught that concerning the cross, it behooves Christians to bear afflictions. This is true, earnest, and unfeigned mortification, to wit, to be exercised with diverse afflictions, and to be crucified with Christ. So again, we have no problem with discipline, and we can even use these traditions to discipline the flesh, and we ought to be disciplining the flesh. But the true mortification is that Christ lays upon us in baptism, by daily setting aside the old man and daily letting the new man arise, the man of faith. In fact, the next paragraph then deals with that entirely. Moreover, they teach that every Christian ought to train and subdue himself with bodily restraints, or bodily exercises and labors, that neither satiety or slothfulness tempt him to sin. But not that we may merit grace, or make satisfaction for sins by such exercises. And such external discipline ought to be urged at all times, not only on a few and set days. And so Christ commands in Luke 21:34 and Matthew 17:21. St. Paul also in 1 Corinthians 9:27 does this. Here he clearly shows that he was keeping under his body, keeping control under his body, not to merit forgiveness of sins by that discipline, but to have his body in subjection and fitted for spiritual things, to discharge the duty according to his calling. So we do not We do not condemn fasting in of itself. What we're saying is that discipline, for the sake of refraining from sin, disciplining our bodies is something that Christ and the apostles urge us and bid us to do, so that we slowly over the course of this life gain control over the flesh. The new man does anyway. And in this, we're using traditions, we're using fastings, we're using these sorts of things to mortify the flesh and to discipline the flesh. Why do we meet every Sunday for service? To discipline the flesh which does not want to hear the word of the Lord. Why do we have other times of the year in which we meet? To discipline the flesh so that we have a time to hear the word of the Lord. Why do we have certain customs over here? Why do we do this? Why do we have all these different traditions? It's all, like we said back with Article 15, for the sake of teaching the gospel and mortifying the flesh so that we are disciplined to hear the word of the Lord, disciplined to abstain from sin by the aid of the Holy Ghost. That's the point of all of these things. Now, we skipped around a little bit in this. We just kind of hit the high points. But I would encourage you, go back and read through Article 26 again with these sorts of things in mind. The real issue at stake here is, what do we do with human traditions? We can't just cast them all out. We're not iconoclasts. And if we do, then, like the Protestants have found out, you're just going to make up your own human traditions, and you're going to have the same problems with those. So how do we think about human traditions? How do we use them, and how are we to not use them? That's what's really going on here on Article 26 of the Distinction of Meats.